There are moments in war that echo far beyond the battlefield, moments where choices become stories and stories become legends. This is one of them, buried beneath the ruins of a forgotten planet scorched by orbital bombardment and poisoned by years of bloodshed. The skies once filled with ships now hum silent over a graveyard of steel and bone. Beneath the shadow of a fallen dreadnought lay the body of HFY, a commander of the Terran Dominion, an elite warrior bred for conquest and trained from birth to despise humanity with a fury rooted in generations of war. Her armor was once a symbol of fear, engraved with the sigils of her clan and polished to shine even under plasma fire. Now it was torn open, shattered across her chest and thigh, reeking fluorescent blood into the cracked earth as her breathing grew shallow and pain gnawed at her fading mind. The retreat order had come without warning. One moment her platoon was advancing across the ridge, the next they were gone, evacuated by command to deem the sector lost, leaving her behind without a word or signal. Her injuries weren't immediate. A blast from a human railgun had thrown her off a ridge into the lower basin where wreckage and bodies had already piled from hours of combat. She had tried to call out Jeshu coordinates for extraction, but her comms were dead crushed in the fall. Her soldiers, those who had sworn blood oaths to follow her into the void, never looked back, not one. She awoke hours later to silence, not the calm kind, the kind that hums with distant threat, the kind where carrion drones search for hit signatures and surviving enemies stalk the wounded for intel. She knew what came next. If the humans found her, they would either interrogate her or finish her quickly. Terran High Command had always told her humans lacked honor, that they fought without tradition or code. But the truth was more complicated. They didn't fight like Terran because they didn't have to. They fought to survive, and it made them dangerous. She dragged herself through the basin, her one functioning arm pulling her across debris and bodies. The ground was slick with coolant, oil, and blood, hers and others. The air burned her lungs. Smoke from ruptured core reactors mixed with the sharp scent of melted alloy. Her vision blurred and refocused as pain throbbed through every nerve. Her leg was beyond saving. Her torso armor had cracked open during the fall, and with every movement, she could feel the fracture in her ribcage grinding bone against bone. Then she heard it, footsteps, heavy ones, human, not the mechanized stomping of warframes but dudes. Grounded, slow, precise, one soldier. Alone she reached for her sidearm, but her hand was trembling too much to grip the weapon. The plasma cell was empty anyway. All she could do now was wait. Her pride told her to spit at the approaching enemy, to curse them in her native tongue. To die was fury in her heart, but something else buried deeper under her training and pain held her silent. Maybe it was the fear, maybe it was something she didn't understand yet. The human stepped into view. He was tall by their standards, broad-shouldered and armored in black exoplate with minimal insignia. A low-ranking grunt, perhaps, or maybe a recon specialist. His helmet visor scanned across the base and then locked onto her. She tensed. Prepared for the shot, but it didn't come instead. He moved closer slowly, deliberately, his rifle stayed down. She looked up at him, her voice ragged from dehydration and pain. When she spoke, it was not with authority or threat. It was a whisper almost lost in the wind. Finish it. He didn't. He knelt beside her, observing the damage not just to her body but her armor. His hand went to his belt, not for a weapon, for a field kit. She didn't understand. This wasn't protocol, this wasn't war. He was supposed to eliminate her and move on. That's what her people would have done. That's what she would have done. But instead, this human was unsealing a pain-suppressant vial and injecting it into her neck joint with surgical precision. He didn't speak, not yet, just worked. She tried to push him away weakly. Her arm barely moved. He ignored it. "You're not going to make it if we stay here," he said finally, his voice deep and steady. "Enemy patrols will sweep this zone by nightfall." His accent was rough, his language universal. She didn't respond, couldn't. Her body was starting to go numb from the painkiller. Still her mind raced. Why was he doing this? There was no tactical reason, no strategic gain in helping a Terran commander. Her capture would lead to complications with his own people. Prisoners were liabilities in human units. Her presence would slow him down, expose him to risk. Saving her made no sense. But he stayed. She tried to speak again, to ask him why, but her throat burned and her eyelids began to close against her will. Before darkness took her, she remembered the last words he said that day. "I'm not leaving anyone behind. Not even you, and with that universe shift just a little.
When she awoke, she was no longer surrounded by corpses or wreckage or the howling wind that scoured the basin. The silence had changed. It was deeper now, denser, broken only by the faint hiss of a thermal blanket and the mechanical ticking of a compact human fueled generator pulsing against the cold. The shelter was crude, little more than a collapsed drop pod hole leaned against a scorched boulder, but it kept out the worst of the ash storms. She was lying on her back, her armor removed, her wounds cleaned and dressed in human gauze. Her side still ached, but the pain was dull now, numbed by whatever they had injected into her. Her leg was braced, her breathing was easier, she was still alive. The human was seated a few meters away, checking his rifle under the low red glow of a portable lamp. His helmet was off, he looked younger than she'd imagined. A scar ran down the side of his jaw, disappearing under a collar stained with ash and dried blood. His eyes were focused, not with the blank professionalism of a medic, but with the quiet calculation of a man who had made too many battlefield decisions alone. His uniform bore no rank, no name, no unit patch, just a dull brass pin on his chest shaped like a broken sword. She didn't speak, not yet. Her throat was still raw and her pride bruised deeper than her wounds. She watched him reload his weapon, recalibrate the drone beacon, and tear a ration pack open with his teeth. He offered her a piece, holding it between gloved fingers. She stared at it, then at him, then back again. "What is this?" she asked finally, her voice dry and cracked. "Protein bar," he said. "Synthetic meat and nutrients. Better than it smells." She took it, not out of trust, but necessity. Her body needed fuel. Her stomach turned with the first bite, but she swallowed it down. Hunger overcame disgust. Silence stretched between them again, not hostile but uncertain. She had been trained her whole life to see humans as enemies, unpredictable, savage, untrustworthy. And yet, here she was, fed and bandaged, still breathing because one of them refused to leave her in the dirt. "You should have killed me," she said, not as a threat but as a fact. He didn't look up, maybe, but I didn't. That choice could cost you your life, your people, your command. If they find out, they won't, he replied. No comms, no uplink. I got separated during the final push. Same as you. She narrowed her eyes. You stayed for me. I stayed because no one else would. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected, empathy. Not weakness, not pity, something else. He had seen too many left behind. Friends, brothers, strangers. Maybe he just couldn't stand to watch another one fade alone, even if she was supposed to be the enemy. "I don't need your mercy," she said. He nodded. "Good, because that's not what this is." That night, the wind howled louder. Plasma rounds lit the far horizon. Enemy scouts swept the upper ridgelines with sensor drones. He pulled her deeper into the shelter, covered her body with thermal netting to mask her heat signature, and lay beside the entry with his rifle trained on the dart. He didn't sleep. She noticed. He barely even blinked. "You have a name?" she asked as dawn approached, the air cooling further. "Marcus." She repeated it under her breath, testing the shape of it in her mouth. "HFY, I know," he said. "Saw your tag, your high command." I was. He didn't comment. He didn't have to. They both knew what it meant to be abandoned by your own. Rank didn't matter when your people wrote you off as lost. In that moment, there was no commander and no soldier. Just two living beings trying not to die on the same cursed rock. 3 days passed. They didn't speak much, not out of hostility, but necessity. Energy needed to be conserved. Movement minimized. Marcus set traps around the perimeter. He scavenged parts from fallen units and reconfigured a signal scrambler to delay enemy scans. He even managed to hack an old supplied rock capsule for water filtration. He didn't boast about it, didn't explain his methods. He just worked and she watched. He dressed her wounds twice a day. He never looked away, never turned his face in shame or pride. His hands were precise, steady. He knew battlefield medicine well, too well for a grunt. And every time he cut away dead tissue or reapplied the bandages, she braced for pain that never came. He knew exactly where not to touch, how far to push, how long before her body started to respond. Her strength began to return, slowly. Her speech grew clearer, her hands steadier. One night, After a passing orbital skirmish at the sky with silent streets, fire, she asked him something she hadn't dared before. Why do you fight? He looked at her for a long time before answering. Because someone has to. That's not a reason, that's a burden. Maybe, but we don't always get to choose which burden is ours. She didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because she finally understood what he meant. Her people had always chosen power, control, the chain of command, but humans, at least this one, they chose something else, responsibility. Even when it was irrational, even when it was hopeless, even when it was her. On the sixth day, the shelter's perimeter alarm best way, Marcus froze. He peered out from the breach in the pod wall, eyes locked on a distant figure moving across the ash field, another human unarmed setting. A recon scout, he whispered to her without turning. If I get caught with you, they'll kill us both. Then leave. He didn't move. You've done enough, she said. Run. You still have a chance. His voice was calm, almost quiet. So do you. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her leg still flared too bright. She bit her lip and stayed down. Marcus grabbed a flare from his pack, cracked it, and tossed it wide into the dead trees. The flash burst bright red. The scout turned toward it and started moving. Marcus leaned in close to her ear. If I don't make it back in 30 minutes, crawl west. Ridge path leads to a canyon. I marked the 6 spots. You see them, bill until you can't. Before she could argue, he was gone, into the smoke, into danger without hesitation. She lay in silence, listening to the distant echoes of confrontation. Her pulse beat against the walls of her skull. Her hand clenched around the grip of the sidearm he had left for her. And for the first time in her life, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want him to die.
She counted the seconds not because she had to, but because it was the only thing she could control. Time in the basin moved differently when survival was uncertain. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity. 30 minutes passed, then 35, then 40, and still there was no sign of him. The flare's echo had long faded into memory, and the only sound now was the low hum of wind scraping across metal and bone. She didn't want to leave. That truth settled heavily in her chest, heavier than the pain in her ribs or the numbness in her leg. It was not about survival anymore. It was about something far stranger and more dangerous than instinct. She cared whether he came back. She who had led a dozen planetary sieges, who had issued the death order on prisoners without hesitation, who had laughed at the idea of human compassion, now found herself wishing for one human's return as if it mattered more than the entire Dominion. The sound came not from the ridge but from below. The rocks shifted softly, boats stood against the broken incline, and then he emerged, limping, blood-streaked across one sleeve, but alive. She exhaled slowly, not with relief but with silent acknowledgement of something she had no name for. He dropped into the shelter and tossed a small encrypted beacon toward her. Spoof their tracker with a false reading. They'll chase ghosts for a while. We're clear for now. She looked at the wound on his arm. You're hurt. It'll hold. You need treatment. He shook his head. You're still the one that can't walk. He handed her a datapad, damaged but working. It showed a topographic scan of the terrain northwest of their position. A canyon choked with wreckage from both sides ran like scars through the Badlands. Beyond it was a derelict outpost, last walled as abandoned 2 rotations ago. Possibly inactive, possibly occupied. It was the only way forward. I can move you, he said. But not fast, not quite. If we wait any longer, this place becomes brave. She studied the map, her fingers tracing the elevation lines. There's a route toward the canyon floor, covered by debris, less visible. It's slower, but safer. He gave her the choice. She was not used to that. In her world, command gave orders and subordinates obeyed. There was no collaboration, no shared risk. She nodded toward the canyon floor. He built a sled from a broken wing strut and thermal blankets rigged with kinetic dampeners to reduce the drag. He tied the harness around his waist and tested it against the incline. When she saw him prepare to pull her, she spoke without thinking. You're doing this for someone else. He paused but didn't look back. What makes you say that? No one fights this hard for a stranger. He didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted the sled stabilizers and started pulling. The canyon was worse than it looked on the map. Ash had settled in thick layers, burying mines and tripwire sensors from old battles. Twice he stopped to disarm proximity charges. Once he had to lift her and carry her across a collapsed bridge where the threat couldn't pass. She didn't speak during those moments, not because of pain, but because something in her chest had begun to shift. A recognition, not just of him, but of herself. She had always believed the Terran were superior not just in strength and intellect but in purpose. Their cause was destiny. Their war righteous. Humans were chaotic emotional creatures, unpredictable and fragile. Yet here in the dead heart of a forgotten world she saw what her doctrines had hidden. His decisions were not born of chaos. They were choices anchored in conviction. When they stopped to rest he didn't speak. He shared his rations, set perimeter alarms, reinforced their position. She studied his movements. They were deliberate practice, honed not by training but by repetition, born of necessity. This man had survived too much for too long. "I was told your kind only fought for profit," she said once while he re-wrapped her splint. "They were wrong. Then why do you keep risking your life?" He looked at her, not with anger but with exhaustion. "Because it's easier than leaving someone behind." She didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because she no longer had the will to deny what she'd seen. That night a storm swept across the canyon. Static discharges danced across the broken towers and ash whipped through the cracks in the walls. He curled near the entrance, rifle at the ready. She reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a warning or command but as a gesture without pretense. "You should sleep." "I don't sleep well anymore." "Why?" "I remember too much." She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. She saw it in the way he moved, the way he always scanned the horizon twice, the way he never turned his back on the open field. She had known soldiers like that in her own ranks once, until they burned out or broke apart. The next day they reached the edge of the canyon. The outpost rose head like black truth against the pale sky. Its walls were cracked, its turrets collapsed, its beacon dark, but with shelter, and it might still have power. He scouted it first alone, leaving her hidden beneath thermal mesh. He returned 20 minutes later, helmet off, jaw clenched. Clear, barely holding together, but it'll work. He carried her inside past collapsed barracks and shattered consoles. A storage bay had one working generator. Lights flickered on like dying stars. For the first time since the war began she felt warmth, not from the heat but from proximity. From the presence of someone who had every reason to hate her yet chose not to. He set her down gently, patched his arm without complaint, and finally sat beside her, not as a guard or medic or savior but as a man without armor, without pretense. She looked at him and asked the question that had been haunting her since the first night. "What do you see when you look at me?" He didn't flinch. Someone was saving, and that answer changed everything.
The lights inside the ruined outpost dimmed and flickered in soft pulses like the breath of a dying star. Dust floated through the shafts of pale yellow glow as if even the air had grown tired of war. He sat with his back against the far wall, rifle across his lap, boots scarred from the track, eyes fixed on the entryway though no one had followed. She sat across from him, braced against the remains of a shattered console, her armor laid out on the floor, slowly drying beside the heater. Her wounds were healing now, not fully but enough. She could feel her strength returning, but the thoughts in her mind no longer revolved around escape or vengeance or tactical advantage. They revolved around him. In another life they would have tried to kill each other. On another world, under different orders, they would have fought without hesitation, without mercy. That was the way their species had trained them. That was the legacy their leaders had handed down like a disease. But now, here beneath the cracked ceiling, in the forgotten quiet of war, no longer relevant, they were no longer enemies. They were no longer strangers. They were survivors. She asked him to tell her about Earth. He didn't smile, but his voice changed. It grew slower, heavier, warmer. He described the rains that smelled of bird leaves, the rivers that shimmered with algae under twin moons, the mountains that rose like ancient gods above the clouds. He told her of markets and music and meals that made no sense but still brought joy. He spoke of cities so loud they never truly slept, children who ran through narrow alleys chasing nothing but light. He spoke of pain too, of things lost, friends buried under the weight of duty, of betrayals and orders and medals that meant nothing after the funerals were done. She listened to every word, memorized every sound, as though language itself could break the distance between what they had been and what they were now becoming. She told him of her home, not as a commander but as a child once raised in the outer spires of a fortress, a world carved into the side of a crystal mountain. She spoke of lessons in ancient philosophy, military ethics, genetic codes passed down like heirlooms. She told him how her people trained their young to see weakness as infection, emotion as failure, mercy as treason. She told him that she had believed it all once and that somewhere deep inside a part of her still did. He didn't judge her, he only listened, and in that silence something inside her softened. On the 9th day the power finally failed. The generator sputtered once, then went cold. They were out of rations, out of medicine, out of time. A patrol would come eventually from either side. The war hadn't ended, it had only moved on to other planets, other conflicts. This place was quiet now, but not for long. They couldn't stay. He checked the nav beacon one last time and saw what he had been hoping for, a signal. Faint, encrypted, distant but human. A recon vessel in low orbit searching for survivors. He looked at her and she already knew. They won't take me, she said. You know that. They might. No, they won't. Then all right. You'd risk everything. I already did. She looked away for a long moment, her eyes catching the fractured remains of her rank insignia resting in the dirt. When she looked back, she wasn't a commander or a Tyrann or a weapon bred for war. She was just HFY, and he was still just Marcus. What will you tell them? That I found a survivor. That she helped me escape. That we wouldn't have made it without each other. They'll question you. Then I'll keep answering until they stop. She stood with effort, leaning against the wall and testing her leg. It held barely. He moved to help, but she waved him off. No more carrying. I walk with you or not at all. He nodded once and swung the beacon across his shoulder. Together they stepped out of the outpost into the pale dawn. The sky was beginning to clear. The ash had thinned. The wind had softened. The ridge path was long and broken, but ahead of them it curved toward the valley where the signal grew stronger. They didn't speak as they walked. There was nothing left to explain. He paused once along the way when they passed the body of a fallen drone half buried in the dirt, its lenses still glowing weakly. He crushed it under his boot without hesitation. No record, no trace. By the time the ship appeared, a low silent silhouette descending through the fog, she could barely keep walking. He kept pace beside her, supporting her just enough to stay without lifting. The ramp lowered slowly, revealing figures in armor, weapons drawn, visors blowing. He stopped before the soldiers, raised one hand and spoke clearly. She's with me. They didn't respond at first. Then a voice crackled through a speaker. She's Tyrann. She's a survivor. You've compromised protocol. I followed the only protocol that mattered. There was a pause. Then the voice returned. Command will want answers. Then I'll give them. The guards didn't lower their weapons. But they didn't fire either. After a long moment they stepped aside. Marcus turned to her. We walk in together or not at all. She looked at the ship, then back at him. Her hand brushed his for just a moment, the contact fleeting but real. Then let's walk. They entered side by side, two soldiers once sworn to destroy each other, now united by something no war had planned for. When the ramp closed behind them and the ship began to rise, the world below vanished into mist and silence. In the quiet that followed no one spoke, but in that silence something impossible had already happened. Not victory, not peace, something smaller, something stronger, understanding.